Good morning, everyone. So nice of you all to come out after a long holiday weekend, a very important weekend to remember the legacy of someone who made an incredible difference in our society. And I certainly want to thank City and State and Effective New York and others who are sponsoring and participating in this forum for focusing on a very important discussion about the plight facing our counties and our local governments broadly, because obviously there's a lot of commonality between what's happening with our counties and local governments as well. City and State is really just doing a magnificent job, not just this morning, but in so many other ways with forums and meetings and obviously with publication to really focus on key state issues and city issues as well. So I'm a regular reader and a big fan, and I hope all of you are as well. And I'm very impressed by the lineup, especially given how busy this week is, obviously with the state of the state and the budget message happening up in Albany, that so many thought leaders that do focus on New York State issues have made time to be on your panels, to be part of the discussion today. So my job, as I've been informed, is to help set the table for your discussions that will continue throughout the day. Obviously, as we're in the modern era, a lot of what I may touch on in terms of the work of the Comptroller's Office is easily accessible on the web. So don't worry about taking copious notes, just go to our website, because we do put a lot of information up there, and we do have a special segment of the website devoted to local government. So whether it's the fiscal stress monitoring system or we just put out our annual report on local governments, all of that information is easily accessible for you on our website. I also want to point out that I'm joined by Gabe Deo, who's our Deputy Controller for Local Government and School District Accountability. Gabe, where are you? Well, you're right there, right in front of me. So Gabe is somebody, if you don't know, it would be smart for you to get to know if you have an interest in issues facing counties or local governments broadly. So with that out of the way, I'll talk really a lot of my task is talking about the fiscal stress monitoring system. But what I'm going to do with my time is really talk more broadly about the challenges facing local governments from our perspective, and as I said, set the table for your discussions and brainstorming that'll happen with the rest of your presentations. So we know we're digging out from a tough economic time. We're still feeling some of the hangover from the global financial crisis, what happened on Wall Street, the impact that that had on all of us, both in the private sector and the public sector as well. Certainly New York was not left out of the job loss that happened in that time. We lost hundreds of thousands of jobs across the state, and obviously the impact in terms of revenue for counties and for governments, state government, local governments all across our state, resulted in the loss of billions of dollars of government revenue. And we've still been adjusting to what has been a difficult reality. Well, the good news is 5 years after that economic bottom, we certainly see improvement in our state's economy, and obviously that will continue to produce some improved climate for our local governments as well. So just to remind you as to where we're at in terms of some of the broader numbers, unemployment rate, very key indicator as to where we're at with the job market, because regardless of what the economists say, unless people feel on the ground that they have an opportunity if they want a job, people are not going to feel in their heads that we are out of a tough time. The unemployment rate for November was 5.9%. That's way down from the recessionary high of 8.9%. For the state, for the city, the unemployment rate was 6.6%, a decline of 1.2% from July to November, a very significant decline for New York City. So certainly we're seeing that private sector job recreation is strong across the state. In fact, the Department of Labor has estimated New York State has grown back about 550,000 jobs over the past 5 years, more jobs than were lost during the recession. So the global numbers sound good. Of course, the challenge is that when you drill down, and we're a big and diverse state, it's a very different picture depending on where you live in New York State. Close to 90% of the job regrowth in our state has happened in the 5 boroughs of New York City and the 2 counties on Long Island. So it's a very different picture in other parts of the state. In fact, New York City, Long Island, Metro Albany, and Metro Ithaca have regained all the jobs that were lost during the recession. And New York City particularly has gained over 400,000 jobs. But you go to places, and I know our great mayor from Syracuse is here, you go to Syracuse, you go to Utica, you go to Binghamton, these areas overall have recovered fewer than 1 in 4 of the jobs that they lost during the Great Recession. And we certainly know that even in the communities where there has been significant job regrowth, many of the new jobs are at the lower end of the wage scale compared to some of the jobs that they replace. So are we in a better condition than we were a number of years ago? Absolutely. Are we seeing continued progress? No question about it. Is it where we want it to be? Clearly, it is not. So all of this, in terms of, I won't go into the other economic statistics, but all of this means that for our state government, for our local governments particularly, there are still significant budgetary and fiscal challenges that we have to contend with. Well, certainly from a state perspective, I think New York has made great strides in getting the state's fiscal house in order, and that's good news. And I give credit to the governor and the legislature for, particularly having more realistic revenue estimates in the budgets that they've presented over the past few years and getting the budgets done on time. But there's no doubt that the real stress points now are at the local level, or counties, towns, villages, cities, or school districts. And that's going to be the reality that we're going to have to contend with in the short run. It's very hard to generalize what factors besides the economy that contribute to a community having issues of budget and fiscal stress. But we see some, I don't want to say commonalities because it's really not a one-size-fits-all prescription, but when you see a community in fiscal stress, often you see a higher relative level of poverty rates, particularly as measured by child poverty. Certainly a trend of flat or decreased state and federal aid to that particular community. Obviously the impact of the economy and loss of jobs, which also often brings a loss of population as well. So particularly for some of our cities, you're seeing a smaller population, an older population, a poorer population that puts more stress in terms of need for services, and obviously the impact of the tough economy in terms of declining property values and what that means for a tax base. So, no surprise, at the local level, tough choices on spending have been the rule of the day. Because of these pressures from 2009 to 2014, municipalities, excluding school districts, have downsized by about 18,000 jobs across our state. We put out, I mentioned earlier, our annual report on local governments. A lot of great data and information in there, so I do recommend you check that out on our website. We found that local government revenues increased by 1.9% and 1.4% in 2012 and 2013, respectively, basically keeping pace with inflation. Total local government expenditures essentially have remained flat over that period. So we're seeing a slight uptick in revenues and basically flat spending when you look at the aggregate numbers. As costs continue to rise, local officials have had to make difficult choices. And our report notes many local governments have cut programs and staff, diminished rainy day funds, deferred maintenance and capital purchases, or have cut services. For example, between 2009 and 2013, counties reduced health service expenditures statewide by $370 million. Cities have cut transportation spending by $33 million. Towns have cut garbage collection by $79 million. Now, obviously, from our perspective in the Comptroller's Office, we always encourage efficiencies and looking for opportunities to be more effective in terms of spending. But while this may reflect these reduced costs, some efficiency steps, I think some of it also just reflects the need to spend less and the reality of what the revenue is. It's meant that for some communities, services that the constituents have come to expect have not been there at the same level. And as often happens, when you cut services, it often has a disproportionate effect on the neediest in a community. So our local officials at the county level and at all levels are having to work hard to deal with this budgetary and economic reality. And of course, they have an added wrinkle to all of this, and that's compliance with the New York State tax cap. The reality is that in our analysis of tax cap information, Virtually all local governments have complied effectively with the reporting requirements. As you know, that's a part of the law that we have to oversee from a compliance perspective. But beyond that, most have stayed within the cap and have clearly demonstrated a commitment in terms of their spending and budget priorities to remain within the parameters of what the tax cap anticipates. Our role as far as the cap is to be sure that local governments comply. We've been involved with more than 1,000 property tax calculations to help local governments and school districts understand the cap. We did a lot when the cap first came in, but of course, people change, personnel change, elected officials change, so that is an ongoing effort on our part for everyone to understand what they need to do to comply with the cap. So what do we do in the Comptroller's Office to try to help navigate through these tough times? We certainly, well, we have an accountability responsibility in terms of audits, and counties are not left out of that, Steve, as you know. We also view our role as being a partner, and we try to expand our efforts in that regard. And that was really the impetus for the fiscal stress monitoring system. It wasn't meant to be we're wagging a finger at someone because we think that they may be headed for trouble. It really is meant to be an early warning system, an opportunity for local officials to better understand what's going on with their budget, and really as important as making sure local officials are aware of what's going on is to make sure the larger community is informed. When we first put the system out, some folks said, "Oh, you're telling us something we know already. You're not doing us any favors. We're just going to get some bad press out of it." But I think one of the challenges is that in many communities, the taxpayers, either because the officials don't want them to know, or just because folks are doing other things, they haven't been able to pay attention, they're not fully aware of what's happening. And if we're going to continue to navigate through a tough time where difficult choices are being made about spending priorities and revenue priorities and choices, we need to have an engaged citizenry that has up-to-date information so they can be better informed about what is confronting a community. I think in the long run, it makes for a better and more democratic process for there to be more information out there. But the bottom line is a simple one. We do not want to see a municipal bankruptcy happen in the state of New York. We've never had one. We don't intend to have one. The consequences would be extremely negative for any community that would go through that. It certainly would be negative for the entire state as well. So our fiscal stress monitoring system, and again, details for that are on the website, and I believe in your booklet there's also one of our summary reports in terms of some of the numbers, so you can take a look at that. As I said, it's meant to be an early warning system for local governments, including counties that are facing significant fiscal and budgetary issues, so corrective steps and actions can be taken before a full financial crisis occurs. As you know, there's a scoring, and then if there is a level of stress, it's broken down to 3 possible categories: significant, moderate, and susceptible. To date, we've reviewed about 2,300 localities, including counties, cities, towns, villages, and school districts. We use financial indicators, and as we develop those indicators, we had the information out there. We got some feedback from local government officials, and we refined our scoring system before we finalized it. The financial indicators are, in summary, year-end fund balances, operating deficits or surpluses, cash position, use of short-term debt for cash flow, and fixed costs. And then each locality is given a score, and then we see if they end up in one of our stress categories. Well, what have we found? We found that counties, interestingly enough, as a class, are experiencing the most stress. 28% are listed in some level of stress. Approximately 13% of school districts, 8% of cities, 3% of villages, and 2% of towns are in one of our categories of stress. So I think your focus today on counties is a very important part of our local government structure. Your focus is appropriate today because we're seeing some significant stress and budget issues at the county level. Thus far, we found 137 local governments and school districts in some level of stress. And although even one community in fiscal stress is too many, we need to, of course, put that number in the context of total local governments in New York, of which we have many, as you know. That 137 figure represents 7% of all local governments scoring high enough to be in one of our stress categories. So 137 may sound like a lot, but in the context of all local governments, it is obviously a 7% figure. The fiscal stress monitoring system has also highlighted some specific challenges that we continue to drill down on. 453 localities have had issues with low fund balance, 191 had high debt service costs, 81 had low levels of cash on hand. The system, in addition to financial indicators, to try to provide more explanation and context for the scoring, also has something of what we call environmental indicators. It doesn't go into the score, but it's meant to try to explain some of what may be contributing to the budgetary and fiscal situation in a given community. These factors sometimes are ones that are out of control of the municipality, but can drive costs or have an impact on revenue. Some I mentioned earlier, many fiscally stressed local governments have high child poverty rates, population losses, declining funding from government partners, labor market decline, and significant reductions in property values. What we try to do on a voluntary basis, obviously, if a local government wants it, is when we see a community in stress, we step up the opportunities that we can provide to help a local government navigate through a tough time. That includes budget reviews, audits, technical assistance. We put a high priority on multi-year financial planning strategies and techniques, and we have staff that works with local officials to help them do that. And obviously there are many training opportunities that we do try to provide to local elected officials and appointed officials as well. What I hope is that our fiscal stress monitoring system will continue to encourage a dialogue at the local level, have communities focus on what their own unique challenges are, and deal with confronting some of those tough budget choices to move towards long-term solutions to budgetary challenges. That being said, our system is relatively new, so we've got 2-year trends. I think we need a couple of more years, because we're going to do this every year, before we could really say that scoring is representing a complete trend. So we always try to put that context for you to consider when you look at our numbers. But as we move forward with this system, we will be able to identify trends that I think will be helpful, not only at the local level, but really at the statewide level for policymakers all across the state. We're pleased that our monitoring system has received some very, very positive reviews from outside validators. Moody's gave us a thumbs up, saying our system to help local governments better identify their fiscal troubles is credit positive. The American Institute of Certified Public Accountants has indicated they want to feature our system as a best practice. And we've gotten attention from other states. Our staff has been, at their request, providing training and information to folks from New Jersey, Michigan, and Washington State that are all interested in replicating some version of our system. We, as I said, on a rolling basis, depending on a calendar year, we'll be updating the scores. Within a week, we expect to put out our next round of school district scores. And in the coming year, we are going to be really looking at the data that we're compiling and try to provide more of a focus on the factors that we think are contributing to stress at the local government level. We're also looking at, staff is looking at the experience that we've gone through with legislative action over the past few years, deficit financing. As you know, in the case of Rockland County, particularly, and also the city of Lockport, expanded role for the Comptroller's Office as far as oversight on budgets. We don't seem to have an appetite in our state of late for the creation of more control boards or oversight boards as we had a few years ago. But what I've asked staff to do is come up with based on the experience of the different communities, including Rockland County, where there has been some kind of a legislative response to budget challenge, to come up with perhaps more of a consistent boilerplate in terms of how the state should respond when a community ends up in a significant stress. So stay tuned on that, and we expect to have more information about that, and obviously look for your opinions on what else we could do in terms of statutory changes to help communities that are facing significant budget issues. There's no doubt that although the state and national economy continues to experience improvement and growth, the fiscal challenges faced by our municipalities, our counties, and others in school districts are going to remain with us. Local government fiscal stress, unfortunately, is the new normal, from my point of view, for the foreseeable future. And that means we're going to have to think long-term about how we're going to resolve this. We, I think, need to, as the state is in better condition, talk about a comprehensive agenda to assist local governments. We must particularly have a focus on our urban centers, particularly with many of our upstate cities, to understand what their challenges are, come up with some practical solutions about how we can assist them and turn around what in some cases has been years of decline. There are no simple solutions, and not all stress is created equal. You know, sometimes, and again, it's hard to generalize, fiscal stress is happening because poor budget choices have been made at the local level. It's not because of some of those external factors. It's just bad choices, short-term decision-making. And that's where hopefully our assistance and guidance can help turn that around. But there's no doubt that some of it does have to do with more structural issues that we do have to address. I want to point out as well that we don't provide our support in a vacuum. Certainly organizations like the Conference of Mayors, obviously the Association of Counties, GFOA, Association of Towns, on their own or in partnership with us, try to put a focus on these issues and provide support to our local elected officials. What I think the most important part of any training has to be about, it gets back to long-term financial planning. You first of all need to know what your problems are. You need to know not just short-term but long-term where your gaps are. That's the only way you're going to come up with a better budgeting strategy and certainly be in a better position to identify what your problems are. So if you do need to reach out for help, you could do that in a more intelligent and effective way. It's one reason why we proposed that. I was very pleased the legislature acted and the governor signed legislation that we offered last year to provide that, you know, we have the Local Government Restructuring Board, another way that New York State is trying to help our localities. There was a specific authorization now that's part of law to allow for the grants that would come out of that process to go for local governments to contract with outside financial experts to develop multi-year financial plans. Some communities can't do this on their own, so this will provide some funding to help them seek outside professional help. So we do need to look at opportunities to assist our local governments. We have been putting out fiscal profiles on local governments, particularly on cities. Again, it's meant to provide a more clear picture as to what's happening locally so we could identify not only problems but possible solutions. Obviously, a big issue is reversing the trends with those communities that have shrinking tax bases. As you know, the governor recently announced an upstate revitalization fund. Perhaps this will be part of the solution for some of our upstate communities, especially our upstate cities. We'll look forward to more of the details on that proposal in the days ahead. Another area where I think we need to look, especially as the state is in a better budget condition, look at the partnership that we have with local governments. As I mentioned in talking to some of the associations in the past, we have not increased the funding in the AIM program, the Aid and Incentives to Municipalities. That's the state's primary general purpose assistance for local governments. It affects our towns, villages, and cities. AIM funding has basically been flat. You look back 5 years ago, it's actually lower than it was 5 years ago. You know, we've increased funding for other programs, certainly education particularly. If we are in a time where we're able to increase funding for other programs, it, I think, is appropriate for us to put on the table discussion of an increase in AIM funding. That will certainly help our local governments deal with their budget challenges and certainly deal with the challenge they have to try to keep their property taxes low. Keep in mind, AIM funding is less than $1 billion. So in the context of other programs that have many billions of dollars spent on it, and even a modest increase there would not have a significant impact on the overall state budget, but I think it would provide some appropriate help. It all gets back to priorities. How much money do you have, and where are you going to put that money? But I do think our local governments, because our taxpayers at the local level are same taxpayers at the state level. So if we're doing better at the state level, but the local governments are all in trouble and taxes are being impacted, well, we're not moving ahead as a state. So we do need to have a more robust discussion on the county agenda and the local government agenda very, very broadly. I think part of what we need to do in examining the fiscal relationship in that sense of partnership, especially if we're going to increase aid at some point, it would not be unreasonable for us to tie increased aid to making sure that appropriate budget and fiscal practices are being adopted. Again, particularly with regard to long-term financial planning. So I think there may be a way, kind of, you know, a reward or an incentive way to say, if we're going to put more aid in this area, make sure you are making certain commitments as a local government to be sure that you will be headed towards a long-term position of budget strength. So I think there are ways for us to have that discussion that can be intelligent and can be thoughtful. So it's multi-year financial planning, it's regular reporting on efforts to move towards structural budget balance if you're a community that's not in budget balance. So I do think tying some of that assistance to those kinds of ideas would make a lot of sense. Obviously for counties, the big discussion often is on Medicaid funding. And I know that's going to be a particular part of the focus, and I know our friend Bill Samuels has been the big champion on that. Obviously in New York State, we put a cap on growth. It still is a significant expense at the county level. It gets back to the question of, with the money that we have at the state level, if the state is going to absorb more of the Medicaid costs, you know, we don't have an unlimited amount of money at the state level. So what are the trade-offs for that? It's a big price tag if the state would absorb it all, depending on the time frame that you would implement. Steve Aquario reminded me earlier that he remembers a young and full-haired assemblyman from Nassau County who chaired local governments at one point and put in a Medicaid takeover bill, but I'll let you talk about that later. But it's an appropriate discussion. Again, as the state is in a stronger financial condition, where does that issue of Medicaid funding fit in with all of that? Steve also, I should point out, has been very effective on behalf of the counties in pointing out other cost areas, preschool special education. And thank you, Steve, on behalf of the Association of Counties for working with our staff as we tightened up some of the regulations and oversight. Some of the audits that we did in that area were because of your suggestions and recommendations. But that's another cost area where I'm sure you have some ideas about more that we could do to help counties control that cost in a better and a more effective way. So there's more that we have to do to help our fiscally challenged local governments, including our counties. The reality is the landscape is not going to change dramatically overnight. Our local officials are going to be confronted with continuing tough choices. Even if we are able to increase state aid in some of the areas that I briefly touched on, that alone is obviously not going to solve the problem. That's not going to be the magic wand that's going to make everything go away. We do have to focus on ways to be more efficient, operate more cost effectively. Obviously that issue of shared services and consolidating services is one that continues to be, I think, an appropriate discussion for all levels of government. But it comes down to, at the local level, making tough choices, hopefully engaging the taxpayers and the citizens in that discussion about what is the appropriate level of public services and what is the price that taxpayers are willing to pay. And isn't that always the challenge for government? You know, we're here in New York City. Let's remember that New York City was on the brink of bankruptcy in the 1970s. Some of us remember that. The solutions that came about because all the stakeholders came together. Business and labor, citizens, government, state government, as well as city government, including a structure of the Financial Control Board, which still exists and still meets once a year. That is an example of the fact that New York, whenever we've had any municipality come to the brink, we've always made sure they don't go over the cliff. And that continues to be our commitment. We're not alone, obviously. There's a lot happening across the country in this area. I know my good friend and our great leader on this issue, Dick Ravitch, is part of your discussion today, and I'm sure he'll share with you the insights he's gained being involved with Detroit and other communities facing stress. No disrespect to Detroit, but we don't want to see a Detroit here in New York, and that's what all of our efforts are very, very much geared to. So now more than ever, it gets back to leadership at the local level, at the state level, innovation and action, and taking this time of challenge as a way to be creative about how we move forward. And I know this morning's discussion is going to be very, very helpful in that regard. So I want to commend City and State, and again, all of you for sponsoring and participating in this important dialogue. Certainly as we head through 2015, any way that we in the Comptroller's Office can partner with you, both in terms of information to help inform the discussion, but also coming up with some solutions, we'd be very, very happy to do that. So let me end on that note, and thank you for your kind attention. And if there's time for questions, I'm here. If there's not,